Thank you for inviting me along today to speak about the work that I do and around design evaluation and my work in the public sector with citizen experiences and citizen designs. I have heard many questions about whether we can effectively measure experiences and the outcomes from design and innovation, and this is something that a lot of people want to know a lot about. I will attempt to answer some of the questions today that are normally asked about evaluating or valuing design. Please note any questions that you have while we go, and then I can try to answer them in the discussion at the very end. You're also free to email them through to me and I can try to answer them offline. There seems to have been a great deal of discussion around in a number of groups about the ability or even the purpose of evaluating innovation, design, and experiences in general. And I want to set the scene today by answering some fundamental questions first. The relationship of design and innovation. Can these things be evaluated? That's the first question. Secondly, why evaluation is actually necessary. And why does it matter to you as a designer or an innovator? And finally, the importance of good evaluation, and particularly in areas like the public sector. I'll then talk about the framework that I have developed, and I'll show you a little bit about how it is applied and the outcomes. Unfortunately, an hour won't give you the full story, but it will give you an idea of whether you want to know more. So what is design and innovation? And that is where I'd like to start, because I need to clarify some terminology around how it is defined in the corporate world and in the public sector, just to make sure that everyone understands how I differentiate some of the different areas. So please note, these are my distinctions and definitions that I've developed based on my research, and that doesn't mean that's everyone's. So that doesn't mean they're also universal. But for the purpose of our discussion here today, they will hopefully mean that we're all on the same page. When I talk about design and innovation, what do I mean? Well, according to many textbook definitions, innovation is any change, either incremental or radical, to the design of a product or a product system, process, experience. So we traditionally associate improvement with innovation, but let's say for argument's sake, that improvement may not be universal. That improvement in one aspect of a design may actually result in a new problem or an issue in another area. So innovation is simply a change in the design and implementation of something, either small or alternatively radical. Design is therefore a method or process for achieving the innovation. These two things are not easily separated. So my background is in design, human-centered, user-centered, visual design, communication design, administrative design, and service design. Design is a highly qualitative, empathetic, creative, humbling, and experimental space. And the purpose of design is to solve problems, and preferably in a way that can be repeated and is beneficial. I often see these terms, design and innovation, used interchangeably, and consequently sometimes they're misunderstood. So can design exist without innovation? As a capability, yes, but with an outcome, no. There is always some kind of innovation produced. Can innovation exist without design? Possibly, but probably not recommended. You may stumble across a great new idea by just sheer dumb luck, but you will need the means to make it repeatable and sustainable, and this will require design. I spent many years trying to convince very senior public servants when I worked in the tax office about the benefits of using good design methods, and that they would enhance, if not dramatically improve, the products, services or processes that the public sector produce. In worst case scenarios, design will produce incremental innovation, but innovation all the same. The outcome being the most important thing here, because really that is what it's all about. We don't do design or innovation for the sake of design or innovation. We don't do it just because we can. We do it for a reason. And that reason usually involves solving a problem or making something better, hopefully. How does it impact the end user? How does it impact the staff who have to then also work with the process that involves the end user? And how does it improve the current state and solve the underlying problem that you're grappling with? So I was asking these questions to people that I worked with because I saw people often try to focus on the process itself rather than the outcome. If we do step 1, 2, and 3, then we'll achieve step 4 in a design process. And step 4 is always good because we followed 1, 2, and 3. There's an assumption, and particularly in the public sector, maybe also in large organisations, that following a process will give you a certain outcome, and that outcome is predefined and that outcome will be good. So design and innovation, though, challenges this thinking. In fact, it challenges many things about large organisations and the public sector, and I'll get to that a little bit later on. Design and innovation is not a process, and you should know this now as students of design. It requires judgment, observation, listening, and often connecting disparate ideas to create something new. And it requires adaptation and evolution. It's not just a process and a method. So then, of course, I was also getting the usual management questions in the tax office at the same time of return on investment. Is our spending or the money expended on this design capability better than what we had before? So could we just do these things without designers? And are we achieving more for that money for less? What are we getting for our money here? Questions that I'm sure you, if not are familiar with now, you will become familiar as a designer or a design manager at some point in the future. And any good designer will know that investing in research and planning up front will give you a better result than if you did nothing. In fact, that applies to a number of capabilities, including project management. You wouldn't employ a builder to build your house without an architectural blueprint of some kind, now would you? So think about all of those moving parts. You could end up with the toilet in the kitchen due to an argument like, well, that was where the main plumbing was installed. Simple logic will tell you that a plan and a good design will make implementation simple, and it will ensure that you come close to achieving what you set out to do. So it actually might seem a bit bizarre to have to prove the value of good design and innovation. The value of design and innovation, it would seem, is actually implicit. So why do we estimate the return on investment? Isn't that the value of this work just obvious? New things, good things are being created. How do you quantify that? Well, there are some very good reasons why we should try. Firstly, the benefit and value of design and innovation is not readily apparent to all stakeholders when you're working on a project. To management, who are often, and I'm making a very broad generalisation here, not all are like this, linear, cost-effective, bottom-line thinkers. Being able to clearly understand the real value, quantifiably and comparatively, is extremely important. This is their reality. And you are designing or developing innovations or products, services, etc. for them as your client. You must remember this as well. They are actually operating in a different frame of reference to what we as designers do. They are your audience, and you must learn to speak their language. Their language is profit, compliance, and return on investment. If you are a user or a human-centered designer and you use these principles in your approach, then you will see that making the outcomes accessible to management and stakeholders is actually part of your job. There is also another really important reason why you should evaluate the effectiveness of your work. It's because you get what you measure. Or as the famous behavioural economist Dan Ariely said, measure what you value because people will value what you measure. If you measure the number of tax returns processed or the amount of liability raised through an audit, then what you get is you will drive auditors where what they value is how much money that they can find from taxpayers. This drives a certain behaviour. With our tax example, rather than having tax officers supporting and helping people to get their tax returns submitted correctly, they will instead be waiting for people to submit and then after the fact, finding every little mistake. They do this because it's the finding the mistakes that proves their value. If you want them to provide a service, you need to value and measure the quality of the service. Instead of a number of audits and liabilities raised, you would need to measure the number of people who contacted the tax office and who, due to assistance we're able to pay the right amount of tax first time and with minimal effort. So the goal that we are shifting has therefore, the goal that we're evaluating has therefore shifted. And these kinds of metrics are, of course, difficult, but they're really important. These metrics are required to change the culture of organisations from purely bureaucratic or process-driven to service or human-centred. So in the case of the public sector, if you want citizens to have good experiences, you need to measure the effectiveness of the design, and that applies for any kind of design experience. The design can be a small change or a radical improvement. You may call it an innovation or a modification. The important thing is that understanding whether the change is doing the right job and whether it is doing it well. So measurement and evaluation of these kinds of complex social impacts, such as citizen experiences, are important. Not just to make the government accountable, but also to focus attention on delivering good service and effectiveness to the community. Measuring, monitoring and reporting will ensure that funding is prioritised and directed at the areas that need it the most. So public administration will remain focused on the right outcomes. So is it possible to measure and evaluate the quality of the design and therefore subsequently the innovation? That's another question that is often asked. And I want to be clear that there are two things that we can talk about when conducting evaluation. And this is often confused with topics like design and innovation. We have an issue of defining design and innovation, but what exactly are we measuring? But rather than debate that, let's just step back and talk about evaluation first. With evaluation, you need to answer and understand what and how questions. First of all, what? What have you delivered? Have you delivered the right outcome or experience? And then how? How well have you delivered the outcome or the experience? And people confuse the goals. They also confuse them with indicators and therefore measures. And then there are two different questions that you have to actually be looking at. So it's really important to get these things right up front. You need to be able to understand both answers to both of these questions for effectiveness of a design to be truly evaluated. So here's an example that might simplify it for you. Think about how you would determine and measure the effectiveness of a new house that's been built. As a homeowner, you might request certain features, and these are requirements. So 4-bedroom, open plan, light and airy. Your goal will be having a home that feels comfy, roomy, caters for all of the activities that your family enjoys and that you look forward to coming home. The experience is about living in the house. The actors or users are the occupants of the house. You need to understand who are those people and what do they see as the purpose in this experience. You are evaluating living in a house and whether it meets the needs of the occupants. So, going back to those two questions, the what. Is the design going to give you the experience you desire? And the how is, has the implementation been as designed and is it of good quality? So the actual design of the house, you're looking at things like how well did the architect do his job or her job? When the homeowner said that they wanted an open plan 4-bedroom house that felt airy, did they get a pokey 3-bedroom home with small windows and a toilet in the garage? The architect may have justified those changes based on the fact that it cost $100,000 less. The quality of the actual implementation of the design is another thing. How well did the builders, plumbers, electricians, etc. do their job? Was it quality workmanship? So they're two different things. It wouldn't matter how well the builder crafted the frames and the plumber installed the wet areas if the design was not what was needed. Conversely, even if the design was great, if the house was built poorly, and there are then issues with things like faulty wiring, plumbing, construction, then the effectiveness would also be considered to be low. The experience of living in a house, this is what we're evaluating. How does the experience meet your expectations? This is the outcome of the design and implementation. So even though it met the brief and was crafted with expertise, is it usable? Do you find that the flow works? Are there problems due to the layout? is the experience different for the adults as opposed to the children? Do you say, if I had to do it again, I would change this thing? These are all effectiveness indicators. In terms of the delivery of design and innovation, you go through the same process, understanding what exactly is the experience that you are delivering and for whom. You set goals, success criteria, and implement the designs. Your evaluation should relate to how well your design and implementation meets the goals that were developed up front. If there was an experience in place before the design process of a new thing, you evaluate the existing process, and then you determine whether this is improved in the new experience. So you could evaluate the existing house that the people were living in, and then compare the same goals and outcomes from the context in that original setting to the ones in the newly built house. Unfortunately, many people get confused with evaluation and spend their time evaluating the experience of building the house. This has its place. If you're assessing whether to work with a builder or a particular supplier again, you might want to do this. And this is what most project evaluation is actually focused on. Did we deliver the design in the most cost-effective way? Not did we deliver the right design in the best way? Understanding the effectiveness of something that is designed, particularly in a social context or in the public sector, it can be done. And this is the measurement framework that I have developed. Conceptually, it is very similar to what we've just discussed. Who are the actors? How are they impacted? What are the goals? Are they achieved? How do the different components of the design work together? The things like the people, the processes, the products, the emotional interactions, and so forth. Was the design delivered as intended? And what was the quality of the craftsmanship? How was the problem solved? Did it create others? So this is the first part of what we talk about when we're measuring. Was it the right design? And then was the design itself high quality? And was the implementation high quality? So I have developed this framework, as I said. It's called the XE measurement framework. It's a way of evaluating the experience created by public sector design. So again, it's a social impact focused measurement evaluation framework. The intent is to measure the quality of experience and the impact that it has on the people involved. That is the staff of the organisations involved, citizens and intermediaries who may be interacting with the citizens. This framework is different to what would be used, say, for a commercial sector project, which would be more focused on satisfaction. A great deal of what happens with public sector and the social impact side has very little to do with directly with satisfaction. Therefore, it needs to be assessed in a slightly different way. So what is an experience? It is all of the aspects that come together as part of people completing a task or a series of tasks, usually to comply or to receive some sort of benefit. And there are multiple components, processes, products, and people who are involved in these experiences. There are also different types and levels of experience, from micro to macro, as well as internal or endo experiences. And this is also part of the classification and measurement in my framework. For example, a micro experience, as you as an individual paying your taxes this year, this would be an example for most people. It's not just completing the form that you're looking at. So the design doesn't just relate to a form or an interface and pressing a button on a computer. The experience actually starts at the beginning of the year when you start to collect documents for your tax return, receipts, other information. You might interact with an accountant, call a help desk, use a website. You'll complete the form. That might be online, or maybe it might be some sort of automatic process where parts of it are filled out. And then you get a notification of assessment and possibly a refund. Or you might need to make a payment. And that is the experience. So all of these aspects, components must come together to achieve the task and for the correct compliance, the outcome, which is paying the correct amount of tax, not too much, not too little. So getting it right, doing it quickly, effortlessly, and with minimal impact, that's also important. That's the outcome. So you can see satisfaction in this particular case really has very little to do with it. No one's going to be happy or satisfied paying their taxes. However, if I was to ask you how effective was the design of the experience, was it easy? Was it seamless? Was it straightforward? Or instead, was it difficult? Did you make mistakes? And were they easy to fix? Did you get it right? Do you even know if you reported correctly and therefore complied with your obligations? So the public sector has a very different exchange to that of what you would consider in an interaction or a design for the public sector, for the private sector, and therefore it has to have a very different approach. There's no direct exchange of goods for services and payment, so that's usually a way of evaluating these things. It is instead an implicit contract of cooperation and compliance for services provided by the government. The government has a monopoly of services, so when things go wrong, it's really hard to hold the public sector accountable, certainly not at the individual level. So that is another reason why having some sort of standardised or evaluation that unpacks effectiveness is really important. Currently, accountability is usually related to things like things that are financial, so cost effectiveness. Did we produce the greatest number of widgets, say, for the lowest price? Or where there is an outcome measured, it's usually at a program level rather than a behavioural level, how it impacts people. Sometimes organisations measure satisfaction, which includes perceptions of things such as professionalism of the people you interact with or overall fairness, but usually only at an aggregate level. So, for example, I can say that for the year 2015, the tax office had 76% of its clients satisfied with the service that they received. But that kind of statistic or metric is sort of a bit weird. How is it useful? Other than as a general direction, so something for management and executives, it doesn't really help improve the service or explain how or where things can be improved. So the framework that I've got can identify the parts of the experience, the quality of a variety of components that support the outcome, that is the correct achievement of the task, and how it impacted the people involved in a number of ways. So for example, I have a case study where I looked at a small business beginning to trade in Australia, and I could identify the weak points in the design and how it could be improved. And these could also be measured and benchmarked to monitor and track over time. So with a bit of effort and the use of my framework, I can tell you an overall quality score for effectiveness, as well as provide a breakdown of individual components assessed on a variety of aspects and determine which areas need to be improved in the experience. Then there is evaluation of the innovation part. How much of a change occurred? So was it incremental? Was it radical? Did it challenge the status quo? Was it disruptive, and did it address existing issues? Did it create new issues? Is an innovation necessarily bad if it doesn't change the existing context? All of these questions can actually be answered and measured with scales. So yes, you can define, measure, and quantify these things. I have developed 2 levels of evaluation with my framework. So a full comprehensive evaluation and what I call an expert review that can be conducted by an evaluator based on interviews and experience mapping. And this means that the evaluation can be conducted despite the level of resourcing for an experience development. So let's talk about the framework itself now and how it's designed. So looking at the slides, there are a number of components to the framework, and I'll talk about the main ones here. So there are the XE heuristics, the XE strata, the full scale, and the expert tool. The model itself provides scores across each of the 4 dimensions as shown here, which we have as process, product, service, and effect. The combination of these scores also gives you a total XE score. Each dimension is created from a number of subdimensions, which are the XE heuristics. There are also a number of potentially shared dimensions that can be used for measurement. So each dimension is a score out of 10. They may be shared subdimensions such as something like orientation, and the product dimensions may actually have products such as a website, which maybe a citizen might need to be able to use to be able to orient themselves within. And the website might also be part of a system where the citizen also needs to be able to orient themselves within and between products. So therefore, dimensions like orientation could be a shared dimension. The final score is then out of 40, in which case all 4 dimensions are used. Some experiences may only use a subset of the dimensions, and in these cases, the total score would be a multiplier of the number of primary dimensions. In addition to the XE score, you can also calculate an intent score. Now, the intent score is an assessment of the difference between the stated goal and the actual perceived outcome. Each experience is given an intent score out of 10. Each experience is also rated in terms of usefulness and desirability, which is a measure of whether people need, want, or desire the experience. The 3 scores are then used to provide information on an experience so that decision makers can see several facets. Did the design and delivery meet the needs and the intent of the experience? Was the experience useful and desirable for citizens? And finally, was the experience effective? Did it enable the achievement of tasks in a way that supported the users? So the framework, stepped ahead there, the framework, which includes the various scores, is actually designed to be modular to allow for the application of the dimensions as appropriate to match the complexity of the type of experience. So I'll use a very simple example to talk us through the evaluation process and hopefully make it a little bit more tangible. So one of the case studies that I looked at was the use of human resources focused game called Can I Help? So the game itself had been designed. It was created by the Canadian Department for Innovation, Science and Economic Development. And the purpose of this game was for teams who work within the public sector to use the game as a way of discussing issues of mental health in the workplace. And the game was facilitated by a game host. Each player would be allocated cards onto which there were hypothetical questions posed about various issues and how this could be addressed in the workplace. The team would then workshop these issues and based on other cards or categories and challenges within a session. Before commencing, the evaluator needs to decide which strata or level of experience you are evaluating. And this requires assessing the level of social interaction of the people who are impacted in the experience and who is actually part of this experience. So the experience here that we're assessing is that of a player or host participating in the game process, which occurs at the meso or the endo levels. And here is the XE strata that looks at the different levels of social interaction when you are trying to examine an experience. So this is one of the things I developed as part of the framework to help you be able to create boundaries and define different experiences. Then you have to use something like an experience map and determine which parts of the experience that you want to evaluate. You may choose the whole experience or only components of it. And for the sake of the example here, we'll talk here about just one part of the experience, which is actually playing the game. So experiencing their game and playing the game. The experience of participating in the game, and this is shown in the very center part of the screen. From this, then the XE scale dimensions are assessed to remove any elements that don't appear in the experience. So for example, in this particular one, we don't have any online or digital components, so they are removed from the evaluation. And the evaluation was sent to a number of players and hosts to assess the overall experience according to the dimensions in the model. When the scores are returned and analysed, we can then determine the relationships between each of the dimensions, which areas are affecting the overall experience, and also overall scores for each dimension. So here we have the different dimensions in the game. And what we had here is that product directly impacted the XE score. We were able to look at it and see that service, the service component of the experience, was fully moderated by affect, and process was partially moderated by affect. Affect being people's emotional responses to the experience. The final scores for each part of the evaluation were 8 for intent, 7.7 for usefulness and desirability, and 35.1 out of 40 for the actual XE score, which puts the actual rating in the very good range on the scale. These bandwidths can also be altered using my framework based on the risk tolerance of the organisation providing the experience. So for an experience with a life-saving service, say like a hospital, the risk tolerance may be low, so the requirement for excellence might mean that an acceptable score is much higher. And this might be different for an organisation such as education, where an acceptable score might be lower. An evaluation can also be conducted using the XE Expert, which is the tool that I mentioned, and this is a very simple interface from that. This allows someone like an independent evaluator, it could be a designer themselves, to answer a series of questions that will also evaluate the experience independently. So you can see here an early prototype of the output from the tool, comparing a number of elements and their weighting. So there's the full measurement and a comparison done with the expert tool. So they're very similar scores, both placed relatively on the same part of the spectrum. This was done, I had actually conducted the evaluation using the expert evaluator tool independently of the survey and the rest of the measurement approach, and I did the full evaluation and the analysis prior to actually completing the analysis around the participant or the user evaluation. Okay, so what did that actually mean? Overall, participants rated the game, Can I Help game highly across all dimensions, and consistently noted that safety and trust was created when playing the game, so that was really important. Players shared the belief that their personal circumstances would not be abused and that they would be used appropriately and only within the context of the game. Safety and security were also rated as the most important factors when playing the game, and many players acknowledged that they had been emotionally impacted by the game, around 39%. 24% stated that they had actually, their views had changed because of the experience. And additional scores included things like the usefulness and desirability and personal effect, which were still at quite high levels. So we could identify the critical components of the experience, so how we would use this, which related to things like security, perception of errors and commitment, and people wanted to feel valued and respected as well as trust other players in the game, and these were core elements in the evaluation. It's unsurprising really that this variable, security, error prevention, commitment, support, was significant as the game was about discussing potential issues and vulnerabilities relating to mental health. And this means that the elements that were most important in the continuation and use of the game as a tool required an ongoing focus on visible signs of safety and security, commitment and support when people were playing the game. Now, I've only shown you an experience here that received a very high evaluation score. However, I can assure you that in the overall set of case studies that I did around the original development, there were 6 case studies, and there were some that received moderate scores around 22 to 24, and one that received a score as low as 16.6 out of 40, 16.16 out of 40, which was quite low. So here's the table that shows some of the different ones. I've actually blocked out what the experiences were to protect the innocent. So you can see that you can get a variety of different scores, and you can then also see which parts of the experience are the weakest parts. So you could focus on those. I hope you found that useful. So in summary, evaluating design is important for responsibility and accountability, not just for the public sector, but for us as designers. We must remain responsible and accountable for the work that we do. Design can be measured and evaluated. This is really important, as a lot of people believe that design cannot be measured, but it can. Evaluation should include both effectiveness and efficiency. So asking the question of, was it the right design, is really important. And of course, was it done well? And finally, design can be quantified using measurement scales. So using quantitative evaluation as well as qualitative understanding of the impact of the experience is really important. So thank you for today, and I look forward to any questions that you might have.